Joining me now is Shadow Climate Change and Energy Minister Ted O'Brien from Queensland. Ted O'Brien, thanks for your time this morning. Let's start then with this issue of your nuclear policy and this briefing paper I revealed at the top of the show. From the New South Wales Chief Scientist, a former nuclear engineer, briefed Cabinet in 2020 about the problems with introducing a nuclear industry in this country. The report found it would involve tens of thousands of nuclear-trained workers we don't have, and said it would be naive to think a power plant could be built in less than 2 decades. Is all that true?
Good morning there, Andrew. And can I just say from the outset, I really enjoyed that interview with Don Farrell, who was disciplined to talk about his colleagues, and he didn't want to stray into any portfolio other than his own of trade until you said nuclear. And what we're finding now is because we are at advanced stages in the coalition of our nuclear part of our policy, Labor, suddenly all their MPs are experts. And you can be sure they will come out, they'll be negative, and they'll be on a talking point script from their party. What they won't be doing is looking across the world at what works best and the importance of a general mix, different technologies within the mix.
Sure.
But to answer your question, there is no doubt that we are going to have different people with different points of view, whether that be on costing, on timing, on locations. And that's good because we actually finally are engaging now in a debate. What we have seen across the world is that countries are moving more and more to have nuclear in their mix because it gets prices down, keeps the lights on. And of course, it's zero emissions. And this is why Australia needs to seriously be looking at this. You can't have over 30 economies right now with nuclear and wanting more. Another 50 in the world wanting to introduce nuclear for the very first time. And here in Australia, we are paying among the highest energy bills in the world. Our grid is wobbling, threats of blackouts. We're already experiencing some blackouts. And we need to get to net zero. So I stand with our peers. I stand with the United Kingdom, the United States, with Japan, with Canada and others who have made it crystal clear. If you want to get to net zero and make sure energy is still affordable and reliable, you must have zero emissions nuclear in your mix.
Sure, but in
the absence of that, you don't have a credible pathway to net zero.
Okay.
And we'll see in Australia prices continue to go up, Andrew.
They had nuclear for years. This is the issue. This is the issue Hugh Durrant-White, who worked on the British nuclear system, has found in this leaked paper. He says, quote, "The skills and experience required to build, operate and maintain a nuclear power reactor and its complete fuel supply chain are substantial and must be built up over many decades. Realistically, Australia will be starting from scratch in developing skills in the whole nuclear power supply chain. Isn't that a problem? Doesn't that mean there's no prospect of nuclear power before 2040 or 2045 in this country?"
The best experts around the world with whom we've been engaging, Andrew, are saying Australia could have nuclear up and running within a 10-year period. Now, there's no doubt that a workforce is key. It doesn't matter what path you venture down. If you look at Labor's path right now, 82% renewables in the grid by 2030. They are 30,000 Sparkies short. 30,000. That workforce is a big issue. If you have a look at the defence portfolio, we know that we've signed up to the AUKUS agreement, nuclear-propelled submarines. One of the key challenges we have there is to ensure that we've got the right workforce in place. If you learn from the UK and from the US and other countries that have nuclear-propelled submarines, they need a civil nuclear industry in order to have a workforce, in order to attract people into that industry. They need to have an end-to-end possibility of a career. And what you see elsewhere is countries that have submarines propelled by nuclear are also countries that have vibrant civil industries, because you need both to deliver on that workforce.
Okay, so
another point I'd make here too, Andrew, is sorry, go ahead.
Do they come from overseas then? The workforce has to come from overseas then, doesn't it? What countries does it come from?
Well, I was going to get to that very point. We indeed need to be working with our international partners. It's not just about the importance of a reactor. It is the importance of an entire supply chain. project management. Nobody, at least no one on the coalition side, is suggesting that suddenly we are going to be designing our new reactor and going towards a first of a kind. Only a few months ago, I was in the UAE. So too was Chris Bowen, my counterpart, attending COP. Now, if you look at what the UAE has done, within a 12-year period, they introduced large reactors from South Korea. I mean, these are Generation 3, the APR 1400s. From a standing start, they were able to then introduce reactors. They were introducing reactors, one a year, right, once they got up and running. That was from a standing start. Australia is not a standing start. We are already a nuclear nation. We already have a nuclear reactor 30 kilometres outside of Sydney. We have the world's largest reserves of uranium. We are now adopting nuclear-propelled submarines. We're not starting from scratch. Indeed, the International Atomic Energy Agency has often complimented Australia's expertise and regulatory framework for our existing nuclear industry. Now, there's more work to build on that, no doubt. But you are diminishing Australia's capability if for those who say that we don't know what we're doing.
Well, 10 years is quite a line that you've given us there. But Mr. Durrant-White, he spoke about how the uranium would have to be shipped overseas to be processed. He wrote about how the skills at ANSTO, that nuclear facility, aren't the same as you need for a nuclear power station. That's why he says you've got to start from scratch. And he wrote, as time has progressed, nuclear has become less and less cost competitive relative to almost every source, including firmed renewables. So 2 nuclear reactors, he said, will cost $40 billion. I mean, is that too much?
Well, I didn't hear the full report, to be honest, Andrew, but I'm guessing by the sounds of it, he's talking about the UK, he's talking about Hinkley C.
Correct.
Nobody I've spoken to has suggested that Australia would be having reactors the size of which they're using at Hinkley C, 1.6 gigawatts. But going to the point of capability, nobody either is suggesting that ANSTO has all the capabilities to suddenly be standing up and running power plants tomorrow. But we're not talking about tomorrow. If other countries have had the capability, the sophistication, the education, the workforce to be able to do this, then I struggle to think of why a politician or a public servant in this country says Australia fails to have that same ability.
Right, how big would they
we'll be able to do this. Of course we could do this.
How big would they be?
I'm sorry, Andrew?
If they're not 1.6 gigawatts, how big are the ones you're looking at?
So nobody has suggested 1.6 gigawatts for Australia. We have been looking at everything from micro-reactors, small reactors, and also next-generation large reactors.
And how big would they be, Mr. O'Brien?
We've got to make...
How many gigawatts?
So the micro reactors, nobody's suggesting they would solve for our grid per se as an on-grid solution. But the ones that are probably the most exciting areas are less than 20 megawatts. On the small modular reactors, they go up as high as about 300 megawatts. And then the large reactors, if you look at the Generation 3, they go as high as probably the only ones as high as I've been looking at is the one probably 1.4, the 1400, the APRs from South Korea are the highest. Now they're the largest in terms of reactor type. Now on any particular site, of course, you can have multiple SMRs, or you can have the larger next generation type. But even the 1400s, Andrew, which is again that larger size, you look at the UAE, which is the newest entrant, and what they have done in just over a decade amidst COVID is to bring on 4 of these large-size reactors. Now, countries around the world are doing this. Why? Because it proves you can actually get prices down, keep the lights on. And there is no credible path to net zero without having nuclear in the mix. And so if we are not prepared to be humble enough to learn from other countries who are getting it far better than Australia is on their energy system, then we're just going to be locked into a pathway dictated by Labor, who has lied to the Australian people. They told us prices are going to get down. You remember the $275 reduction household promise? Well, that's not happening. Emissions are going up in Australia for the first time in years, and the grid is vulnerable. This is a broken path from Labor.
Okay.
There's a better way. We need to learn from overseas.
All right, but who's paying for these if they happen? Because is it the federal government? Because a couple of the states have their power generation privatised. So do you see the federal government, under your plan, paying for part of or all of these nuclear power plants?
Andrew, while I probably have to say we haven't yet announced our policy, etc., so I won't go into an enormous amount of detail. However, it doesn't matter what form of energy infrastructure you are looking at. The government does play a role. That's the case today. And it plays different roles. In some cases, in Snowy 2.0, for example, the government plays an ownership role. When you look at the rollout of industrial scale renewables, Labor has introduced the capacity investment scheme on top of the other schemes that are out there at the moment. Labor won't tell us how much that costs, of course, tens of billions we assume, but it's a black hole. Labor won't say it. So look, there is a role for government, there's no doubt, regardless of the energy infrastructure type. And that'll be the case when it comes to zero emissions nuclear also.
Can you confirm we're looking at you're looking at 5 or 6 sites?
Andrew, we'll have to wait until the policy is announced. But I think it's fair that Australians have been asking us, saying, all right, you've made it clear that you truly believe that we do need zero emissions nuclear energy. Where are they going to go? And what we have said is, learning from overseas, we believe in a coal to nuclear strategy. And the experts are saying the best locations are communities that have hosted coal plants for both soft and hard infrastructure reasons. Soft reasons is the socio-economic makeup. These are communities that have high energy IQ, typically workforces that can easily transition. And on the hard infrastructure, you can leverage transmission lines and reduce the capital expense. One of the reports of the Department of Energy in the United States suggested that the upfront capital costs can reduce by as much as over 30% if you can leverage these existing transmission lines. And so we've been, again, learning from overseas, and there's no doubt that a coal to nuclear strategy is what we have in mind. Again, with zero emissions nuclear, working as part of a balanced mix, so wind, solar, hydro, and zero emissions nuclear. And we're going to need gas too, of course, all the way through. And so it's the balance that counts. It's not about pitting one technology against another. It's about making sure you've got the right complementarity between them. They've got to work together as partners. And so that's the pathway we're looking at.
Where does the nuclear waste go?
So the nuclear waste would be stored on site, which is the case in other countries. And again, I cannot find any industry that better manages its waste than nuclear. They know precisely where all the waste is. And so we know that once, of course, a nuclear industry, a regulator and a implementation office gets established, they'll be looking at options around reprocessing and so forth. Noting that the spent fuel that comes out of the ANSTO reactor does get sent to the likes of the UK and France for reprocessing, then it comes back as intermediate waste, but that's ANSTO. For a civil industry in Australia, we would do as they do overseas, and it would be stored on site. And as for a permanent storage facility, right now the Albanese government is looking for just that. As part of our AUKUS arrangement, we need to ensure that we are storing high-level waste from those submarine reactors. And so, learning again from the UK, it makes sense that it's the same location that hosts both nuclear from the subs and nuclear from the civil plants. Makes sense for the UK, makes sense for Australia, but that's a matter for the Albanese government.
Okay.
And we stand to work constructively with them on just that, by the way.
Almost out of time, sorry, Ted O'Brien, but I just wanted to ask you about the vehicle efficiency standards, the so-called ute tax. You've been mounting an attack against it. Do you think the government should abandon this altogether, or if they agree to negotiate with industry, do you see a way forward on some form of standards? What about the argument only Russia doesn't have these standards? What about the argument in the papers this morning Chris Bowen's put out it could save people up to $1,800 a year on their petrol?
Nothing Chris Bowen says is true. He hasn't delivered on any one of his promises, and so I would just dismiss immediately any guarantee when it has a dollar figure against it that Chris Bowen says. The Coalition said from the get-go, Andrew, that we're happy to work constructively with the government, but they have to strike the right balance between emissions, price and choice. They have failed to strike any balance there. We haven't come out opposed in principle to a fuel efficiency standard, but that's not what this is. This is a tax. I mean, at the end of the day, if you are going to have Australians pay up to $25,000 more for their vehicles, that is a tax. Australia's top 5 vehicles will not meet the standards introduced by Labor. They are going to be taxed. In the midst of a cost of living crisis, this is a tax. But if the government wants to go back to the drawing board and get that balance right between emissions, price and choice, work constructively with industry, they too can work constructively with us, and we're up for that discussion.
Ted O'Brien, thanks so much for your time.